Today I'll be talking about David Grossman's Sea Under Love. So every few months I find myself reading a novel that kind of defies being rated because it's so different from anything else that I've read. To give it any kind of rating like 5 stars or 2 thumbs up or even saying good or bad, I think it's a little bit irrelevant in these cases. But I will say that this novel, Sea Under Love, is kind of simultaneously impactful and meaningful and experimental and fragmented writing. I did find it to be quite a beautiful story, but it's one that requires the reader to follow the shifting techniques of the writer. The novel is organized in 4 different parts, and I'll go through each of those parts right now. It begins with the childhood of our protagonist, whose name is Momik. His childhood is lived in the shadow of the Holocaust. He's surrounded by friends and family who lived through the labor camps, and they only speak of the labor camps in these kind of coded words, similar to how American families shy away from discussions around sexuality with their kids. But Momik finds himself hanging around kind of his mentally unstable or senile great uncle, whose name is Anshel. And Anshel is kind of always talking to himself. He's walking around the town in kind of a disheveled state. But we learn that he's talking about a lot of the events that he witnessed during the Holocaust in the labor camps. And towards the end of this part of the book, Momik actually tries to force Anshel to tell his stories coherently, and the attempt fails miserably. Momik basically has to stay in the dark as a kid about what actually happened with his family, why a lot of his neighbors are behaving in kind of mentally unstable ways. And we know as the reader that they're dealing with the aftermath or the trauma of the Holocaust. Second part of the book takes place about 3 decades later, and Momik has become a writer, perhaps due to the repression of trauma that he was exposed to as a child. He's grown kind of bitter and very fearful of the world. And that's primarily seen in his portrayal of Bruno, who is the protagonist of a story he's in the process of writing. Bruno is a Polish prisoner who plans his escape by turning himself into a fish. And in his new underwater world, all memory and history is lost. So both happiness and tragedy of the past is kind of irrelevant in this world, in favor of the present moment, which is stripped of meaning because it has no conception of what happened before it. "There is no longing for the past," Bruno said, "only a passion for the future. There are no immortal works. There are no eternal values except for the value of creation itself, which is not a value at all but a biological drive. Look at them," Bruno continued. And now he looked like a real fish, swimming delightedly across the water-soaked green folio that floated beneath us in the abyss. "These are people without memory, first-hand souls, who in order to continue to exist, must recreate language and love and each coming moment anew." The third part of the book. This is where, from snippets of stories that Momik remembers his great uncle telling, Momik decides to write the story of his great uncle's experience in the labor camp. And in Momik's retelling, Anshel made a deal with one of the camp directors. And that deal is Anshel will tell one imaginative story per day to the director in exchange for the director attempting to murder him, which sounds a little bit odd, but for Anshel that would be kind of a reward because he would be taken out of his misery in a way. Unfortunately, all attempts to kill Anshel fail. But through this set of stories that Anshul, who is kind of nicknamed Scheherazade by the director, through the stories he tells, Momik receives kind of a new hopeful perspective on his own existence and on the human capacity for love and for grace. And he observes that grace occurring on multiple levels, from the Nazi oppressor himself to how his great uncle responds to different things, and also from this fictional story that his great uncle is telling. Fourth part of the book, the last part, from Anshul's stories, which again he's telling to the camp director. From these fictional stories comes a character named Kazik. Kazik is a child of two of the other imaginary characters. But the fourth part of the book is just an encyclopedia of terms and ideas from Kazik's life. All of these correspond roughly to both Anshul's imaginary world and Momik's memories of his own childhood. Okay, the most difficult thing about this book is there's a perpetual shape-shifting that Grossman performs with each section of the book. For example, in part 1, it's told entirely from the 9-year-old Momik's perspective, and it seems pretty stylistically perfect as his naive observations morph from one to the next without a lot of formal structure or without transitions. And this kind of resembles the way a child would tell a story in general. So I have a pony, and we went to the park, and the pony went into the forest, and in the forest there was a groundhog, and the magical groundhog said, "You have to go home." In part 2 of the story, the difficult thing is that this whole thing is told in kind of flowery, Joycean, metaphoric prose that I think is always pretty stream of conscious. Again, though, this style, even though it's so difficult to get into and to understand what's actually happening, it's kind of perfect for this world that Grossman is creating, or rather in the story that Momik is creating for Bruno. Because this, again, is the world where memory and contextual meaning simply don't exist. I really struggled with part 3 as well, but I think that part 3 is kind of the most masterful writing of the entire book. I'd say parts 1 and 3. And it's very difficult because constantly Grossman is switching without warning from Momik's thoughts and action to Momik's imaginary discussions with his characters, to his approach to the writing process, to memories of his great uncle, to the actions of Anshul and the camp director, to Anshul's imaginary story, to Anshul's own imaginary discussion with his characters. So within a single paragraph, the reader could receive 4 or 5 different facets of content, and they all revolve around a single plot point. And this kind of layering of content and the blurred lines between author and character, this offers kind of a completely maximalist but very sophisticated approach to fiction writing in general. And that's why I say that this book can't really be rated or ranked. It reminded me a lot of, in music, which is my background, we have this idea called counterpoint. Counterpoint is where you have independent melodies kind of all stacked on top of one another. And each of those melodies can exist by itself and can make sense by itself. But when you stack them, it creates chords or it creates harmony. And the third part of See Under Love is definitely an exercise in counterpoint. Again, it's about the layers and how they're all lining up with one another while still being stacked on top. So to wrap this up, I think that See Under Love is so groundbreaking, and it is a masterpiece. Since it was written in 1989, I do know that it's become kind of a classic of Hebrew, Jewish, and Israeli literature. And I also know that Grossman has become an important social and political figure in the Middle East fight for peace. He's even received a number of peace prizes and international arts awards. He has a very interesting life story, one that involves a bit of tragedy as recently as about 10 years ago. But he's an excellent writer. And in terms of its literary style, I do think this book is so difficult to read that it may not be best to start with Sea Under Love if you're wanting to read a bit of David Grossman's work. But based on your approach, I do think that Sea Under Love has the potential to be so rewarding, and it's entirely deserving in my mind of a second read and also of just getting into his complete works in general. I'm going to conclude the video by reading a bit of the third part of the book, and that is when Anshul reveals his characters for his fictional story to Momik. And all of this is happening in Momik's mind. And it really just is about the writing process in general, how a character is born. I think that Grossman is kind of describing this process in such a unique way, and actually I've never heard it described before. So here it is. He put his notebook down and leaned his head against the wall. His eyes were shut. He was waiting for something. I didn't know what, and I asked him, "Granduncle, what are we waiting for?" But he was silent, and I asked him, "What should we do now?" The next moment we were no longer alone. The air was all aquiver. My hand began to tremble as though it had a life of its own. My fingers pulled and pressed together. I looked at them in astonishment. They started to pull, but there was nothing there. They didn't stop moving. They groped. They prodded the air to make it flow towards them in a certain pattern. They propelled it wisely, stubbornly, churned it into a thicker substance, and suddenly there was moisture on my fingertips, and I understood that I was drawing the story out of nothingness. The sensations and words in flattened image, embryonic creatures, still wet, blinking in the light with remnants of the nourishing placenta of memory, trying to stand up on their wobbly legs and tottering like a day-old deer, till they were strong enough to stand before me with a measure of confidence. But there were still others waiting to be born, and the invisible womb contracted, and Grandfather Anshul was panting, and his face was red and perspiring.